And now for more on this, we're joined by Asia One correspondent Jagruti Dave, live from Washington, D.C. Jagruti, thank you so much for being with us now. What do you have about the possibility of U.S. fresh strikes on Iran this weekend?
Yes, these are US media reports, as you mentioned, that suggest that the US could launch one of its most brutal strikes against Iranian energy infrastructure that could last through the weekend. This is not something that is guaranteed to happen. It's not set in stone. It could be called off at any point. It might not go ahead. So this is no official confirmation as yet of anything. President Trump threatened to hit Iran very hard. Obviously, talks, there have been complications with negotiations, those escalation of tit-for-tat strikes, recent American fatalities, all of these are contributing to the US considering what it does next. But there is no indication as yet that these strikes are official in any way, but we've been hearing reports for a while now of the US potentially mulling over, say, a 2-week plan was one report of expanded strikes. But there are at the same time considerations, for example, reports of US dwindling munitions that are making part of the calculations, I suppose, that the US is making as to whether it goes ahead with strikes or not.
So, Jagruti, what factors is the Trump administration weighing as it considers maybe the risk of a broader regional escalation?
Yes, indeed. I think, we touched upon just now the more specific calculation of US stockpile of weapons, whether the US has enough of a back catalogue, as it were, to go forth on an expanded US operation against Iran, escalating those strikes. But I think in terms of regional concerns, if Iran retaliates, it's already retaliated against US air bases in neighboring Gulf countries, Bahrain and Qatar, for example. But if Iran responds, which it has threatened to do so, or is considering to do so in the event of US strikes this weekend, if Iran responds by attacking energy infrastructure in the Gulf, well, the concerns are that will further exacerbate an energy crunch or create even more pressure on the energy markets around the world, which have already seen a rise in oil prices. In the US, we've seen comparable, the follow-on effect of that, which is the rise in gas prices, which is affecting domestically the politics here. But globally, then, you've got problems with supply of oil that affects the price of oil, the fluctuations in the markets, which causes huge amounts of unpredictability. We've already seen in the past, because of airstrikes, concerns about companies like the airline industry worrying about a shortfall of jet fuel that can result from an energy crunch. And then you've got the secondary potential choke point in the Red Sea, with the Houthis threatening to blockade the Bab al-Mandab Strait in the Red Sea. And so all of these are wider considerations, which I think Gulf allies have been in the past have advised the president to hold off on strikes, and he's listened to them in the past. We've had the Saudi defense minister who's been in Washington talking directly to President Trump, saying that Saudi Arabia wants to de-escalate and that they can handle any of the issues they have themselves with the Houthis. They do not want they do not need the US to get involved. Again, an indication that Gulf allies are also worried about the impact on them if there is further escalation.
So, Jagruti, you spoke about the possibility of retaliation. What is the U.S. administration saying about the possibility of retaliating again against its interests in the region?
Yes, indeed. So with those worries that Iran could retaliate, you've got US embassies in the Gulf and from Amman to Baghdad, who are all warning of a potential unforeseen escalation. So the US mission to the UAE, for example, is saying Due to heightened tensions in the Middle East, the security environment remains complex. Americans currently in the Middle East should exercise caution and heightened vigilance, and should be prepared for flight cancellations, periodic airspace closures, and potential travel disruptions. The US State Department is also telling Americans outside of the Middle East to avoid traveling to the region. So there are clearly worries that if the US goes ahead with airstrikes, then Iran will respond in kind, and that will affect airspace and Americans in the region.
So, Jagruti, if this happens and the United States carries out attacks, of course, Iran is going to retaliate. How is this going to affect the prospect for diplomacy in the Middle East?
Yeah, I think the key point here is the question that everyone is asking: is an escalated campaign against Iran going to make them change their position in negotiations? Are they going to relinquish the leverage they have on the Strait of Hormuz following military pressure? Are they going to accept some of their red lines? Are they going to essentially negotiate differently? And a lot of experts are suggesting that military pressure is not going to make Iran change their stance, that they haven't done so far, and that they are willing to bear the pain, calculating perhaps that their adversaries are likely to buckle first under the unpopularity domestically of an escalated campaign, but also that they will suffer from the cost and the dwindling of their own stockpile. Washington is calculating that they can degrade Iran's defensive capabilities to such an extent, and cause, through sanctions as well, cause such domestic pressure for Iran that they will have to come to the negotiating table under different terms, and accept different terms, or accept the US conditions. But I mean, one of the things that Iran is doing is that it is talking with Oman at the moment in negotiations, and one of the things that they were discussing is how Iran could manage the strait by leveraging tolls and fees. This has been very unpopular here in the United States. You know, you've had Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, talking to foreign ministers in the Philippines in a meeting, saying an ASEAN meeting, basically saying that this would set a dangerous precedent if Iran were to allowed to exact tolls. Does an extended military campaign prevent Iran from exacting tolls? That is one key question that's being asked. So I think with negotiations, you know, the US has often complained about Iran being unserious about negotiations, but at the heart of negotiations is a deep distrust on both sides, with Iran wondering whether the US will negotiate in earnest at all, and the US wondering the same thing about Iran. So I think the pressure intensifies if a military campaign gets underway, but whether that changes the reality of what happens at the negotiating table is very unclear.
Jagruti Dave, thank you so much.